There we go. Lenore Zann, welcome to this wonderful interview where we're going to talk a little bit about Bill C-226, what the heck it is, what people can do, why they should care. A lot to cover today. Welcome, Lenore.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Before we get into our questions for today, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, Lenore?
Wow. Okay. First of all, I was born in Australia and we emigrated to Canada when I was 8. And when I was living in Australia, I spent a lot of time in the bush, in the Australian bush, with my grandmother, who lived beside an Aboriginal Indigenous reserve in a place called Karua, which is about 100 miles, 150 miles north of Sydney. And one of my grandmother's best friends was an older Aboriginal lady named Mrs. Ping, who lived down the dirt road from us. And she looked after and was bringing up a house full of children who had been abandoned by their mothers because the mothers had either been impregnated or by different people. They didn't want the kids. Anyway, Mrs. Ping was bringing up this house full of kids, and they became my first friends. So, because I was an only child. And so Mrs. Ping and my grandmother would oftentimes have tea, and they'd tell us stories about the bush and nature, and they talked about nature, both of them, like nature was alive and it was like our mother, and that we need to protect and preserve it. I mean, I got that from a very early age from both my grandmother and Mrs. Ping. And the kids and I would run back and forth between my grandmother's and their grandmother's place. And I noticed at one time that some people were throwing garbage at their lawn, at their property, and just dumping garbage there. And I said to my grandmother, "Why are people doing that to Mrs. Ping?" And my grandmother said, because some people are racists and they think that they are more important and better off because of the color of their skin. And so therefore they are treating Mrs. Ping as if she was garbage. And that resonated with me. It hurt me to the quick. I thought, how awful that people would feel that way and act that way. um, it just made no sense to me at all. So fast forward, when I'm, in Canada, I became an actress for many, many years. Then I went into politics. And when Dr. Ingrid Waldron came to me suggesting about environmental racism and explained to me what it was, suddenly I had this lightning bolt where I remembered about Mrs. Ping and how I felt. And I realized, yeah, this is something that is happening that I felt in a particular place where I could try to do something about.
Thank you for sharing that with us. That is literally from the beginning of your life, having this awareness and having your grandmother quite overtly tell you what the problem was.
Yeah,
And as you point out, then years later, you find yourself in situations where you have this light bulb moment saying, oh, that's what she was talking about. I remember this, you know?
exactly. Exactly. I'd seen it, I'd experienced it. Whereas when you talk about racism with with white people, they kind of go, well, come on, I don't know. Does it really exist? I mean, and I'm like, yeah, it does. Well, while I go into stores, nobody bothers me. I'm like, yeah, because you're white, you're white. you know, Maybe if you went into a store with a friend who was black or brown or whatever, maybe you might experience something different. But it's hard sometimes for white people to actually conceptualize the emotion, the way that people look, the way they treat you. Just, you can tell the difference. You can tell the difference when somebody's racist. And, so I think that's why it's so important for me to step up as an ally and say, yeah, racism is real. And yeah, we need to do something about it.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Now, that term in and of itself, as you pointed out, has caused some consternation on some side, some confusion
Right.
maybe on some other sides. So let me take you back, if I can, to 2014, a little
Mhm.
while ago, way pre-pandemic, if we can remember that.
10 years
So,
ago.
so
Hmm.
there is what's being dubbed an environmental racism bill that is going through a certain process right now. What some people may not know is this is not really a brand new bill, that this actually has been in process in some way since 2014. So why don't you take us back there, Lenore? How did this begin and what has that journey been like?
So I became a member of the Legislative Assembly of Nova Scotia in 2009. That was my first election. I won four terms in office, one after the other, three provincially in Nova Scotia, and the fourth one was federal. So in 2009 to 2013, I was a backbencher in the then first ever NDP government of Nova Scotia. But in 2013, the NDP, we lost government, and I became one of seven MLAs in the NDP, six cabinet ministers, former cabinet ministers, and me. And because there were only seven of us and we were in opposition, we had to take on a number of different critic portfolios. So I had about 10 critic portfolios, one of which was environment. And uh, yeah, one of which was environment, and Indigenous affairs was another. And so I got a message that Dr. Ingrid Waldron wanted to meet with me to talk to me about a particular issue, which she was calling environmental racism. And I didn't know what that was at the time, and I didn't know Dr. Ingrid Waldron. But my friend, Dr. Lynn Jones, who's a neighbor of mine and a friend, and her brother, Dr. Rocky Jones, who is a human rights advocate and lawyer, and a political mentor of mine, I was very, very interested in anything that they wanted to bring forward. And Lynn Jones told me Dr. Ingrid Waldron was wanting to meet with me to talk about this particular issue. So I agreed to meet with Dr. Ingrid Waldron, and we went to a coffee shop, and she explained what environmental racism was. And she basically explained that it's the disproportionate number of toxic waste sites, dumps, landfills, and corporate polluters that are placed on or beside racialized communities. And because of that, they had disproportionate adverse health effects. And as she described this to me, I just went, yeah, right, duh. Um, and Ingrid also told me that I was the only politician of 52 politicians in that legislature who had agreed to meet with her. None of the other ones wanted to meet with her. So she said, you know, what can we do about this issue? And I thought for a minute and I said, well, I'm not in government anymore. We're not the governing party. We're the third party, actually. So we don't have much power. However, I could introduce a private member's bill addressing the issue of environmental racism, and we can push to try and get it to second reading, which would mean it would have to be debated on the floor of the House. I said, now here's the thing, we're the third party, it's not going to pass. The governing party will not pass it because I'm in the third party. They just won't. However, what we can do is bring the issue to public awareness and get people hopefully talking about it, and try to educate the public and government officials about what this really is, about what environmental racism really is. And hopefully there will be some kind of a push so that we can get something done about it. I said, that's probably the most I can do at this point. And she said, okay, well, let's do that. And that's what we did. So I introduced Bill 111, an act to address environmental racism. And it was, after it was introduced, it became known as really the first bill of its kind in North America. especially calling it environmental racism. And there was a lot of debate about whether or not you should have racism in there. I'm like, of course you have to have racism in there because that's what it's about. But again, white people are so scared of that word, but I insisted. And so we introduced it, and sure enough, it didn't pass. However, it was so nice the day we got it to second reading to see the gallery in the legislature full of Black and brown faces, people who this meant something to, who were, cheering, even though you're not supposed to make any noise inside of a chamber. But they were so grateful and happy that we were bringing this forward. And sure enough, it got a lot of attention, and people started talking about it. And then people started reminiscing and remembering, oh, yeah, when I lived in such and such, or Africville, or here or there, whenever the dump was right near our homes, right near our communities. And one member of the legislature in a different party, an opposite party, came to me later and said, Lenore, you got me thinking. My mother used to have to take the washing off the line at 4 o'clock every day because seagulls would come to the dump, which was right beside the community, and they would eat all the stuff that had just been dumped, and then they would poop on everything in our community. So people had to wash their cars again. Mothers had to take the washing off the lines. He said, I'm all of a sudden going, right, yeah, that's environmental racism. I'm like, yeah, that's right, it is. So that was the beginning of the bill.
Thank you for sharing that. It's amazing what one term, the extreme emotional responses, it can gather, but it's also interesting when people begin to understand, then they finally begin connecting it in their mind to things that
Yeah,
they've experienced, which no doubt was the whole point of, as you said, you knew darn well that this wasn't going to pass. It was more of a let's get it into the public conversation exercise,
yes,
which appeared to be quite successful.
exactly, exactly. And one of the things that that bothers me about environmental racism that is that when you get people online who will comment things like, "Well, what's environmental racism? I suppose you're saying trees are racist now." Like they don't even bother reading the story or whatever about what it is. They just immediately want to negate it and make up some silly, ridiculous thing about what it might mean, as opposed to actually looking at it and thinking about it carefully and considering it and going, oh, yeah, okay, wow. Yeah, maybe that is something we should look into, you know?
Yeah, I definitely do know. Very, very common, unfortunately. Hopefully, that's something that, the movement of this bill will work to reduce a little bit. Before
Exactly.
we move on to digging into the bill itself a little bit in terms of what it is and why it matters, was there anything else that you wanted to say just about that journey of the bill?
Uh, no, I mean, I introduced it that first time, and then I introduced it, I think, three more times in the ensuing years as I was an MLA and still the environment critic. And so I did introduce it right up until 2019. The beginning of 2019, I reintroduced it again. And then I left provincial politics and decided to run federally, and this time for the Liberal Party of Canada for Mr. Trudeau, because I felt that I had a better chance of winning. And I also knew that I wanted to bring this bill forward on a federal, national level. And I felt if I was with the governing party, you have a lot of environmentalists in the party, including the environment minister. I felt like, and with Prime Minister Trudeau was very, very keen on green bills and environment. I talked to him before I decided to come over. I felt like, okay, this will be the next phase of this bill. I'm going to see if I can make it go federal and go right across the country.
And indeed, that has happened. So as you pointed out, it did start as Bill 111 provincially. If memory serves, it then went, when it was first introduced federally, I believe it was C-230. And then
Correct.
that, of course, died on the order papers, I believe, in 2021 because an election was called. And then
2020,
after, I think,
2021. Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
2021. And then, if I remember correctly, Elizabeth May, herself an MP, then comes in and says, let's try this again.
Yep.
Now it's Bill C-226. And now where we're at is, of course, it's gone through a certain part of the process, and we're waiting to see what's next. And that's why this is an important time for people to understand exactly what this bill is. So, having gone through that process, let me ask you about that piece. What is this bill? And why does it actually matter?
So environmental racism, I mean, it can be defined as racial discrimination in the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and other racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities. Also, in the lack of political power of these communities, the lack of power that they have for resisting the placement of these industrial polluters in their communities, and also in the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and, in many cases, life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities, and in the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities. And also, we have to remember the history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory boards. So, this bill would make government have to collect data because there's been a lack of data about environmental hazards and their effects on racialized and low-income people. And this has obscured the problem and hampered efforts to advance environmental justice. So this federal bill will mandate government to examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and the adverse health effects due to disproportionate environmental pollution on or close to racialized communities. And it stipulates that the Canadian government must gather that data and devise a strategy that would make recommendations to redress the issue. And once again, this bill is a Canadian first. We've had so much of a broad and diverse coalition of environmental and civil society groups, including Ecojustice and the David Suzuki Foundation, urging Parliament to approve, first of all, my bill, Bill C-230, and now Bill C-226. And, I was just honored when Elizabeth May, who had become a friend of mine while I was in government, when she contacted me and said, Lenore, I'm so sorry you lost your seat, but would you mind if I reintroduce your bill because you can't? And I said, absolutely. Please do so. And I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I said, I will fly to Ottawa and meet with the Prime Minister and the Minister of the Environment, who used to be the director of Greenpeace, and ask them to support the bill with coming from you. Because I know how government works. If something comes from a different party, oftentimes governments aren't going to do it. So I flew to Ottawa and I asked for meetings with them, and they both met with me and they said, Lenore, absolutely, we will support the bill. And yeah, we believe in it and anything for you. And we will support it and we want to make sure it goes through. So I'm thrilled. And now it's in the Senate. It has passed the House of Commons. It's passed the Environment Committee, and now it's in the Senate, and it's due ready for the Environment Committee in the Senate. And if it passes at the Environment Committee in the Senate, then it will come back, and chances are it's going to pass.
Well, goodness knows we've all got our fingers crossed that that's the case.
Yes.
There's been so many attempts, in various different circles and different levels of politics by different people over
Yes,
time. So it really has been this collective effort.
it
Uh,
has.
and, when you think about your experience with this, Lenore, you of course have had a very overtly political experience, as an MLA, then as an MP. You've had this experience with the bill, trying to push it forward, on a provincial level, then looking at the federal level, and then later even not as a current politician supporting another politician, right, to put it forward on the federal level. So when you think about all of this with your former politician hat on and also with your general member of the public hat on, why do you think that this bill has taken so very long to pass? You talked about 2014 and here we are, right? Literally 10 years later. Why do you think this has taken so long to pass? Like what barriers have you seen come up here?
Well, to be honest, when I introduced the bill federally the first time around, luckily, between the Liberals and the NDP, we had enough votes to keep passing it. It got to second reading. It passed the Environmental Committee. I got to report it back to the House on June 22nd of June 22nd of 21. And so it had a lot of steam behind it, but the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, interestingly, when they rose to speak about it, they both denied the existence of racism. In fact, the conservative critic for the environment said I should be ashamed of myself for suggesting that Canadians that Canadians can be racist. And the woman from the Quebecois claimed that there was no racism in Quebec, and that they wanted, and at one point we tried to talk to her to say, look, can't you support this bill? We don't really need the extra votes, but we would like to have it. And she tried to say if we could take certain parts of it out and make it not about race, just make it socioeconomic. I mean, that guts the whole bill. Why would we bother doing that? So, this particular bill, a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice, will ensure that all people benefit equally from environment policies that will protect them regardless of race and economic status. That's why it's important.
Well said. And that is a shocking commentary, quite frankly, that you just gave. And it's about what you're essentially saying is that really the barriers here are, shall we say, social or of an awareness nature. So people seem to recognize or be okay with the socioeconomic factor of it, right? But somehow when we start using that R word, right, racism, when we
Yeah.
even start talking about the existence of it, the fact that people are denying the very existence of racism writ large, then going even further and saying, well, how dare you even
Exactly.
suggest or discuss it? And then even go further and say, this all looks good, but let's take the environmental racism piece out of it, and then we're good to go. I mean,
Right.
where does this leave us, this type of mentality?
Well, sadly, you all you have to do is look across the border at the United States, and you see right-wing politicians trying to stop teaching about history in schools and trying to take racism out of the history books, whitewashing everything, pretending it never happened, denying it. This is that's a step backwards. Until we can all agree that every single person is equal and deserving of equal rights and to be protected and have the right to health and happiness and freedom, then unfortunately these stumbling blocks are going to keep continuing. And as far as I'm concerned, I was very grateful to be part of two very progressive governments, an NDP government in Nova Scotia and the federal Liberal government in Canada with Prime Minister Trudeau, trying to really push the needle, all of us, farther and make people healthy with healthy environments and admitting that there is racism and bigotry and try to protect people against that. I think this is the way forward, and we cannot allow ourselves to go backwards, because look at what's going on in the United States.
Absolutely. I think we can get, we like to kind of sit on our laurels a bit here in
Mhm.
Canada and be quite critical of what's happening to our neighbors in the South without perhaps fully recognizing that we are by no means immune.
Right.
They're our largest trading partner. There's all kinds of reasons why what we see happening there, I think we should be paying a lot of attention to. So
Yeah.
thank you for mentioning that.
I
Uh,
do will say one more thing about that
sure.
too. In my time in government, I also discovered when there were, like, first of all, some of the earlier pandemics that were occurring, like the SARS flu that was killing people. When we first came out and they said that pregnant women and Indigenous people needed to get the protection shots first, it was amazing to me the racism against Indigenous people that came up. And it was flagrant, it was so in your face. And it shocked me that that there's so many Canadians are bigoted against our Indigenous First Nations people.
It is shocking when one hears about these things in theory, and sometimes one is in a certain room or part of a certain conversation where you actually get to hear it. And I agree, it's painful. It can be
It-
physically painful,
yeah.
and very difficult to understand. But thank you for sharing that too. That's a very important piece. Just to bring all this together, Lenore, we've talked about what this literally 10-year journey has been like about this bill, the people that have been involved. We've talked about why it's important and to who. We've talked about some of the barriers that you've seen throughout this process and what that means for where we are. Now, you also told us exactly where the bill is right now. You've told us that it has gone through the first part of that process, which is the House, and
Mm.
now it is in the process of going through the Senate. And you mentioned the Environmental Committee in particular.
Yeah.
Because this is where the bill is now, it does present opportunities for public engagement and for people to really engage with their elected officials and to
Right.
engage with the system writ large. So when you think, Lenore, about your average member of the public in
Mhm.
so-called Canada, at this point in time, what do you think is the most impactful thing that they can do to really move this bill forward?
I think that it will really help if they can make phone calls and send emails to their elected representatives demanding that they pass this bill as quickly as possible. And at this point, it would be to the senators. So because it's in the Senate, I would say send it to the senators. If some of your organizations can come up with a list of the senators and send it out to people so that they can have it readily at their disposal where they send these emails to. I think they need to hear from the public that this is something that they really want they want to get on and they want to make it pass as quickly as possible. We need to get it into the Environment Committee, and in order to do that, they should also write to and phone the liberal members as well and say, please make sure this happens, and to the conservatives as well. I mean, they're not going to vote for it, probably most of them, but if we can have a majority of senators who support the bill, it will pass.
I wonder too if, because you've spoken so eloquently about what the deeper cultural issue is here about essentially the denial of racism. And if it's not the denial of racism outright, it might be the denial of environmental racism or any combination of different layers of denial. Do you
Mhm.
have any thoughts on what, again, we as members of the public can do to make movement on that larger social issue, the denial of racism, the extreme denial of environmental racism?
Well, it's interesting because here we are in 2024 having the same conversation that people have been having since the 1950s, the 60s, 70s, you know, human rights, civil rights. Here we are trying to figure out how can we ensure that everybody is treated equally in a society where, you know, African Americans and African Canadians were brought over to North America by force and were given really a terrible beginning and are trying to make up for lost time. And you have a whole colonial mentality still of people who feel like, well, what are they complaining about? You know, I've got it hard too. And I'm like, yeah, actually, you know, the whole white, you know, the fact that we have certain abilities to move up the socioeconomic ladder because of the color of our skin, it just shouldn't be an issue. So, as a human being, I am now once again an actor after 12 years as a public official. For, you know, 4 terms, I'm now an actor again. And I am working on shows where I talk about emotional content that is important to me. And also, right now in the X-Men, the animated series, talking about justice and fighting for the rights of people to simply exist. And in my many conversations and panels and Comic Cons that I appear at as a guest and podcasts, I talk about the issues that are important to me, which the X-Men also stand for. So when not Spike Lee, sorry, when Stan Lee wrote the original X-Men, he wrote it with the civil rights in mind. And mutants were his way of saying people who were feared and hated because they were othered. And in this climate, it also is about the LGBTQ community and all of the many attacks that they're receiving. And so I think that we all need to just look inside our hearts and look at what our qualities are that we can bring to the table and try and use those in a creative way to touch people's hearts and minds so that we can change the, you know, the way people treat others.
That's so beautiful and well said. Those are all my official questions for you, Lenore, but I wanted to give you a chance if there's anything that you'd like to say. Perhaps there's something I haven't asked you that you feel really needs to be said on this issue. So if there's anything like that, please proceed.
I think you've covered it. I really do. I think you covered it.
I
Yeah.
think you covered it too, for the record. So I
Thanks.
guess what I will do then is thank you for joining us and for taking the time and for sharing not only the journey of the last 10 years, but also where you're at now and what that means for the bill too.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And yeah, all the best. And let's hope this bill passed. Let's do everything we can to get it going.
Fingers crossed.
All right, sweetheart.